Look at this car for a second. Just look at it. Rounded roof, 3 little chrome bars across the grille, a shape so ordinary you'd drive past a dozen of them without blinking. This is a Ford Anglia 100E, and I need you to understand something before we go any further. This unremarkable little sedan did more to change Ford's future in Britain than almost anything else the company built that decade. Nobody talks about it that way. Nobody puts it on a pedestal. It doesn't show up on posters, but by the end of this video, you're going to see this ordinary car completely differently. Here's the promise. Underneath that plain, forgettable body, there was a fight going on. A fight between the future and the past. Between what Ford wanted to build and what Ford could actually afford to build. And the way that fight played out quietly shaped the roads of Britain for the rest of the 1950s. Stay with me, because the deeper we go, the stranger this story gets. Let's go back to where this story really starts. Not in 1953, when the car launched. Earlier than that. In the years right after the war. Britain in the early 1950s was still digging itself out. Rationing hadn't fully ended. Money was tight, and it stayed tight for longer than most people expected. Ford's answer to the ordinary family car at that point was frankly an antique. The old Anglia, the E494A, was a design that traced its bones back to before the war. Upright, boxy. A sit-up-and-beg shape, as people called it at the time, with the driver perched high and the fenders sitting out proud on either side. It ran a tiny 933 cubic centimeter engine making 23 horsepower. It was cheap. It was reliable, in its own stubborn, old-fashioned way. But it was not modern, and everybody knew it. Even Ford knew it. So when the 100E finally rolled out, in 1953, first shown to the world at the Paris Motor Show that year, it looked like a leap into a new era. The 2-door Anglia came first, followed a few months later by the 4-door Prefect, a more upscale cousin built on the very same platform, told apart mostly by trim, an aeroplane badge on the Prefect's bonnet instead of the Anglia's arrow, and a slightly richer interior. And here's the part that barely anyone talks about now, the part that gives this whole story its teeth. Pay attention to this. The factory that built it, Ford's Dagenham plant, wasn't just a car factory. It sat on reclaimed land beside the Thames, built almost like its own industrial island. It made its own steel, from raw materials, using electricity and gas that Ford itself generated on site. At the time, it was considered the most complex car manufacturing site in all of Europe. Think about that for a second. This ordinary, little Anglia was rolling off one of the most advanced and self-sufficient industrial operations on the entire continent. A humble little family car, born inside a genuinely ambitious machine most of its owners never even thought about. It's worth knowing that Ford hadn't invented unitary construction out of nowhere for this car. The bigger Consul and Zephyr models had already introduced it to the British lineup a couple of years earlier, at the very start of the 1950s, as flagship, higher-priced cars. What made the 100E genuinely significant is that Ford took that same expensive, modern engineering idea and pushed it all the way down into the cheap end of the range, into the car an ordinary working family might actually be able to save up for. That's not a small decision. That's a company betting that the future belonged in everyone's driveway, not just the wealthy one. And the car itself wasn't just a facelift stitched onto an old design. This was the first time Ford brought monocoque construction, a true unitary body, down into its affordable range in Britain. No more separate ladder chassis bolted underneath a body shell riveted on top. The body itself was now the structure, lighter, stiffer, and far cheaper to build at scale once the tooling was in place. It also debuted a new front suspension layout, using coil springs and telescopic dampers, a design that would soon become known across the whole industry as the McPherson strut. Hydraulic brakes replaced the old mechanical linkage setup. The electrical system jumped up to 12 volts. On paper, this was, genuinely, a modern small car, arguably more advanced under the skin than anything Ford had ever sold at this price point in Britain before. But here's where it gets interesting. Here's the detail that never made it into the brochure. Underneath all that new body engineering, Ford kept the old engine. The same basic 1,172 cubic centimeter side valve four-cylinder, reworked with bigger bearings, larger inlet valves, and pump-assisted cooling. But still, fundamentally, an old design, already considered somewhat outdated, even by 1953 standards. 36 horsepower, moving a car that weighed in around 737 kilograms. Paired with a 3-speed gearbox, at a moment when several competitors were already moving toward 4 speeds. Some buyers could option a semi-automatic gearbox called Manumatic, an attempt to modernize the driving feel without touching the tired old engine underneath at all. Compare that to what came before it, and the gap becomes obvious fast. The old upright Anglia looked like something pulled straight out of the 1930s, tall, narrow, with fenders bolted on as separate pieces you could see the joins of. The 100E, by contrast, had flush, straight bodywork from nose to tail, one of the first Ford designs in Britain to really commit to that smooth, 3-box shape, no exposed running boards. No tall, narrow engine bay. Even the 3 horizontal chrome bars across that grille were treated almost like a fashion statement, a small flourish to signal that this was a car built for a new decade, not a leftover from the last one. This is the real story of the 100E, a brand new house, built around an old engine. Ford spent its money where buyers could see it and feel it. The shape, the ride quality, the comfort, the modern look, and quietly held back on the one component that actually made the car move. It's a pattern you'll recognize if you've ever bought anything that looked new on the outside but felt strangely familiar underneath. Let's talk about what it was actually like to own one of these. Inside, the seats were trimmed in tough PVC, easy to wipe clean after a muddy Sunday drive, and on the 2-door Anglia, they hinged forward so passengers could squeeze into the back seat. A heater and a radio were optional extras, not standard equipment, because in 1953 Britain, those were still small luxuries most families thought twice about. The wheelbase measured just 87 inches, the shortest in the entire Anglia lineup, which made the car nimble and easy to place on a narrow British lane, though on wet tarmac. That shorter wheelbase and quick, 2-turn steering could get genuinely twitchy at the back end if you weren't paying attention. And here's a small, honest detail that tells you a lot about where Ford's priorities really sat. The windscreen wipers ran on vacuum power, drawn straight off the engine, a cheap and simple system, but one with a well-known flaw. Push hard on the accelerator, climbing a hill in the rain, and the wipers would slow right down, sometimes almost to a stop, at the exact moment you needed them working properly. Owners of the era learned to live with it. It would take until the next generation of Anglia for Ford to finally switch over to a proper electric system. It's a tiny thing, but it says everything about this car. Modern where it counted for sales, old-fashioned where it didn't cost Ford a single order. Now here's a piece of real, documented proof, not marketing talk, not nostalgia. When the British magazine Motor Road tested a late version of this car, in 1959, they clocked a top speed of 73.8 miles per hour. 0 to 60 took 26.9 seconds, which tells you plenty about what performance actually meant for an ordinary family in that era. Fuel economy came in around 41.2 miles per gallon, and the price for that test car, with tax included, came to £610, of which £180 was pure tax. For an ordinary working family in post-war Britain, that was a serious, carefully saved for sum of money for a car that, by then, some rivals were already outpacing in outright modernity. Before we go further, if this kind of real automotive history is something you actually enjoy, hit subscribe now. This channel digs into the ordinary machines that quietly built the world you grew up in, not just the flashy ones everyone else covers. And if you remember riding in a car like this, or your father or grandfather owned one, drop it in the comments below. I genuinely want to hear it. A quick like helps this reach more people who'd appreciate a story like this too. Think about what buying a car actually meant for a family back then. This wasn't a casual purchase you financed on a whim. In post-war Britain, a car like this represented years of careful saving, of putting a little aside week by week, of choosing this over other things a family might have wanted. When that Anglia finally sat in the driveway, or more often, out on the street in front of a terraced house, because plenty of families didn't even have a driveway to park it on, it wasn't just transport. It was proof that things were finally getting a little easier. It was a small, rolling symbol that the hard years were, slowly, starting to loosen their grip. The 100E didn't just appear once and sit still. Ford kept expanding the family built around it. In 1955, estate versions arrived, the Escort, based on the Anglia, and the more upscale Squire, based on the four-door Prefect, complete with wood-look trim panels along the sides and a horizontally split tailgate, which meant relocating the fuel tank entirely to make room. Small commercial vans, badged as Thames, borrowed the same underpinnings to serve tradesmen and delivery businesses right across the country, the quiet, unglamorous backbone of countless small British firms. Then, in 1957, Ford gave the whole range a midlife refresh: new tail lights, a larger rear window, a simplified mesh grille in place of the heavier three-bar design, an updated dashboard, and for a short window, buyers could even order a clutchless gear change system called Newton Drive, a rare option today and a real curiosity among collectors. This wasn't a car that appeared once and vanished into the background. It was a slow, steady, expanding presence, working its way into vans, estates, and family driveways across an entire decade of British life, year after year, quietly becoming part of the furniture of the country. But here's where we get to the real climax of this story, the part that actually explains why this ordinary car mattered. By the time production ended, in 1959, Ford had built 345,841 units of the 100E Anglia saloon alone, not even counting the Prefect, the estates, or the vans built alongside it on the same lines. Let that number sit with you for a moment. 345,000 cars, of a design that, by its final years, was mechanically behind rivals like the Fiat 1100, and behind the newer Morris Minor with its own 1,000 cubic centimeter engine. Journalists of the era knew it. Enthusiasts knew it. This was not, by any measure, the most advanced small car on British roads by 1959. And yet it sold, and sold, and kept on selling. Add in the four-door Prefect built on the very same platform, over 100,000 of those on its own, and you start to see the true scale of what was quietly happening on those production lines at Dagenham, year after year, largely unnoticed outside the industry itself. Across the entire history of the Anglia name, from before the war right through to the mid-1960s, Ford would eventually build close to 1.5 million of them. The 100E sits right in the middle of that story, as the generation that proved the formula actually worked at scale. Here's the uncomfortable truth hiding behind those sales figures. This unglamorous, old-hearted little car was the one actually paying the bills. It was the workhorse that kept Dagenham's production lines running at full tilt, that funded tooling, that kept dealers stocked and salesmen employed. While Ford quietly developed something far more radical behind closed doors. That next car, the Anglia 105E, launched in 1959, arrived with genuinely new styling, influenced by American design language of the era, right down to a rear window that sloped backward in a way nobody in Britain had really seen before. A proper overhead valve engine at last, and a reputation that would eventually make it by far the more famous of the two. In its very first full year on sale, it would go on to set a brand new production record for the company, with well over 190,000 units built in a single year alone. But that car never gets built without the 100E holding the line first. The unglamorous car did the unglamorous work. It carried Ford of Britain through 6 straight years of steady, unspectacular, essential business, quietly generating the volume, the cash, and the manufacturing confidence, so that something flashier could follow right behind it. That's the real lesson buried inside this whole story. The car that gets remembered as boring is very often the car that actually built the foundation everything else stood on. Nobody throws a parade for the workhorse. Nobody writes songs about the reliable one. But take it away, and nothing else ever gets built at all. There's one more layer to this story, and it's a warmer one. Today, the 100E has a real second life. Because so many mechanical parts were shared across the Anglia, the Prefect, the Escort estate, and the vans, it became a genuine favorite among hot rodders and restorers, people who prize exactly the kind of parts interchangeability that Ford originally built in purely to save money on the assembly line, decade after decade later, turned into an unexpected gift for enthusiasts, keeping these cars alive and running on the road today. If you're old enough to remember Britain in the 1950s, there's a real chance a car like this one sat outside your childhood home or belonged to someone in your family who worked hard, week after week, to afford it. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't quick off the line, but it was real, dependable in its own quiet way, and it was theirs, in a country that was still rebuilding itself, piece by piece, street by street. And maybe that's why this car still finds its way back into conversations at classic car meets, in old photographs pulled out of a drawer, in a story someone's father used to tell about learning to drive on cold, wet mornings with wipers that barely worked. It never asked to be remembered as important. It just kept starting, kept running, kept carrying people to work and to church and to the seaside on a Sunday for 6 straight years, without ever once demanding the spotlight. That's what this whole story really comes down to. In the end, not every transformation announces itself with fireworks and headlines. Sometimes it just quietly does the job, decade after decade, until one day you look back and realize just how much weight it was actually carrying the whole time, mostly unnoticed. So here's the truth worth sitting with. The flashy machines get remembered. The steady ones get quietly forgotten. But if you ignore the steady ones, you never really understand how anything real got built in the first place. If this story meant something to you, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next one. Leave a comment and tell me what part of this stuck with you the most. The Dagenham factory running on its own steel, that old engine hiding under a genuinely modern body, or those 345,000 ordinary cars quietly doing the real work while nobody was watching. Give this video a like if you enjoyed it, and if you know someone who'd appreciate a story like this, an old car guy, a family member who remembers Britain in the 50s firsthand, send it their way. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.